Hello, I'd like to welcome Gigi to have a conversation with me today. So you're very welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be speaking with you today.
So we've already started having a bit of a conversation around PoTS and EDS. So my understanding is you've had the diagnostic labels of PoTS and EDS. Are there any other diagnostic labels that you've been given in your journey?
Many. So I had Ehlers-Danlos, so I was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos type 3, hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos. I was diagnosed with PoTS. I was diagnosed with interstitial cystitis. I had some doctors saying that I had fibromyalgia. I had forms of fatigue, which depending on who you speak to, some people would say chronic fatigue. So I had many different terms banded around, idiopathic pain, many different diagnoses. But the first two were Ehlers-Danlos and PoTS.
Mm-hmm. So when did symptoms first start for you? What was your journey with the symptoms?
Well, when I first was diagnosed, I wasn't actually diagnosed based off my symptoms. I was diagnosed when I was 13 with Ehlers-Danlos and around 14 with PoTS. And but when I was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos, it wasn't actually because I was experiencing anything particularly difficult. I was a very normal, happy, healthy child. It's just my doctor began to notice that I looked slightly different from other kids. So I was very tall. I'm now 6'1", so I'm still very tall, very skinny, disproportionately long arms and fingers, sunken chest, short-sighted. And so he was really concerned, or there was a concern that I had what's known as Marfan syndrome, which has some health consequences that need to be regularly monitored. So he really wanted me to get genetic testing to make sure that had been ruled out, because I also had a prolapse of my left ventricle. So that was another incidental finding. So I had genetic testing, and when the genetic testing happily came back clear, I was then automatically diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos type 3, which I now believe is called hypermobility Ehlers-Danlos. And that's where my diagnosis first came in. And shortly after that initial diagnosis, I had an accident actually, and I severed my Achilles tendon, and that was obviously a very physical thing, and I recovered fine. But during that accident, or as part of the process, my doctor told me, "Oh, you're very lucky that you survived, actually, because this was something that was very nasty." And it was around 4 or 5 months after that I started getting my first symptoms. And the first symptoms I experienced were things like dizziness. I developed neuropathic type sensations, so I would have tingling. I would have this funny sensation that felt like a bit like an egg cracking on my head, and I would feel what felt like yolk running down my head until it reached around my eyes, and then I would feel like I was about to faint. So I would have these fainting spells. When I was in a really big flare up, I would really struggle to sit up in bed. My heart rate would go through the roof, over 200. My blood pressure would drop, and I would really struggle to maintain my body temperature. So I'd very typically get extraordinarily cold. I would start violently shaking. And during one of my many visits to A&E, they would put these heated blankets over me, and it would make absolutely no difference. I would just continue shaking. I would have difficulty, this then developed into difficulty swallowing. And over time, it just sort of morphed from typical PoTS type symptoms of dizziness, blood pressure dropping, fainting spells, to more widespread generalized pain, which then culminated in an experience of interstitial cystitis, where I had chronic bladder and pelvic pain, which was also equally as debilitating.
And how old were you when all of this was going on? So at age 13, you were given this EDS diagnosis, and when did the other symptoms start to develop?
So all of my symptoms started, they just continued and progressed basically over the course of a decade. So it lasted quite a long time, and I just got progressively worse. Initially, the symptoms were more manageable. I was still able to be in school and function, although I would sort of have these occasional flare-ups. But the older I got, the more the more it progressed, and the progressively worse I became, to the point where I effectively became bedbound. I wasn't able to work, and my mum was my primary carer. She just looked after me, and I lived at home because I couldn't actually live life normally.
And how many years were you like that for? Very low functioning.
Well, it's really hard to say because it all sort of slowly morphed from one thing into the next. So I always say that my overall arc lasted around a decade, slightly longer. But my really debilitating symptoms started from around age 17, and they lasted for many years. So I mean, it was something that sort of morphed and shifted and changed, but the generalized pattern was that it just got worse and worse.
And so where are you at now? Just tell us what you do.
Oh, well, now, my goodness, I'm totally symptom free. So still as hypermobile as I ever was, but not experiencing any PoTS type symptoms, not experiencing any pain at all, not experiencing any of the neuropathic type sensations or the ocular disturbances that I had. And so now I work, I run a pain coaching service where I help other people become symptom free, using mind body approaches, which is ultimately what led me to getting well.
Great. So you said you use mind body approaches. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you did? How did you get yourself well?
Yeah, well, this was a process in and of itself. So I come from a scientific background, so I did biology at Oxford. So I was really interested. My career trajectory is I wanted to be in academia and I wanted to do academic research. And when I was unwell, the only energy any energy that I would have, I would focus on basically spending all of my time reading the academic literature on PoTS or interstitial cystitis or anything that I could get my hands on, and trying to see if there were any new papers that had come out that I could focus on, or any new developments in treatment. And shockingly enough, this did not get me well, because if you read those papers, they are incredibly depressing. They say we don't know what causes it, we don't know why it happens, and treatment options are limited. So that didn't really help me. I was lucky enough to have my mum, who, as I said, was really the main person looking after me, and she was my biggest health advocate, and she never gave up hope, and she was also a lot more open-minded than I was. So she stumbled across a podcast that discussed symptoms in new light, discussed symptoms in terms of being non-structural in nature, and how by using mind body approaches we can retrain our brain to activate greater feelings of safety and comfort, which allows the danger alarm signals to switch off. So when she said this to me initially, I was incredibly skeptical, coming from this background, and I said the way I interpreted it was her saying to me, your symptoms are all in your head. That's how I processed it, is she was saying to me that my symptoms were imaginary. Now, I know that if you're somebody who's experienced PoTS type sensations or any other sensations, chronic pain, the one thing you know is that these symptoms are not in your head, they are real. And so I was immediately incredibly insulted by the notion that this was something that I was making up or being dramatic about or being hypersensitive to. So it really took me a long period of time to even be introduced to the concept, because I would immediately dismiss it. But it did plant a seed in my head, and classic me doing all the research, I started shifting my research focus to reading more in the literature about these type of techniques and learning a little bit more about the neuroscience of pain generation and symptom generation. And what I read was fascinating. I mean, we've grown up in a society where we automatically assume that physical sensations mean that there is a structural problem. And yet all of the neuroscience coming out today demonstrates that not only does the brain produce danger alarm signals in response to structural problems, but the brain can produce danger alarm signals in the absence of structural problems, and actually in response to perceived danger, which can come in many, many forms and in many different contexts. So I really sort of began to educate myself on this and realized that actually it is possible for people with extraordinarily severe symptoms to the root cause of those symptoms to be non-structural in nature. So that was really the beginning of my journey with all of this. And the more I researched and the more I understood, the more I was able to reframe my perspective on what my symptoms meant. And rather than viewing them as a problem, as something that my brain was doing wrong or something that my body was doing wrong, actually viewed it as these were all symptoms, or they were all symptomatic of an overwhelmed brain, of a brain whose danger alarm signal was continuously firing. And that was understandable given the fact that I was terrified. I was terrified of my symptoms and terrified of my future.
I often, when I work with my clients, instead of using the word symptom, which is kind of medicalizing this, I talk about sensations. There's sensations that are in our body. And like you said, often with PoTS, anything sort of mind body, you think, oh, so you're saying it's all in my head, I'm making it up. And it's like, no, you're not. Again, I tend to refer that it's in your nervous system. We know that PoTS is due to a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system and the immune system. So we know that, but then it's taking another step. Well, what is going on from a nervous system point of view to create that dysregulation that we know that's occurring?
Yeah, exactly. The root cause, it's not in your head, it's your brain.
Yeah, and the nervous system. And it's separating that out. It's different. And when you can grasp that, then it helps shift that perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, what controls the autonomic nervous system? The brain. And when the brain is overwhelmed, it's a bit like having a computer that has too many tabs open. It begins to freeze. You might get the wheel of death. And that's exactly what happens with our symptoms. When our brain is overwhelmed, it is unable to control and regulate the processes that it normally does so well. And this involves all of the autonomic nervous system regulation. So that's why when our brain is overwhelmed, all of these processes that it can normally deal with, temperature regulation, blood pressure regulation, all of these things can go a bit haywire. So our experience is real. The fainting spells are real, but the root cause of them is the fact that the brain is just struggling to process all of the emotional stimuli that it's receiving.
So we've already started talking about what we think might be going on from a nervous system point of view with these symptom sensations. But for you, what do you feel contributed to this overwhelmed nervous system to create these sensations?
Well, I think that there are two main causes, and this is the same with many different things in life. Part of it is genetic and part of it is environmental. So I know that in my family, I like to describe what I have. I think I have a smaller emotional barrel. So I'm naturally a hypersensitive person. I've always been like this my entire life. And so it doesn't take a lot for my emotional barrel to fill up and for this to overspill in the form of sensations. But in combination with that, I also had a lot of stresses, environmental stresses growing up. You know, this might be difficulties at school or in relationships or in family dynamics. And over time, when you don't have an outlet for this, these events build up over time. And I was the type of person where I was incredibly perfectionistic. I wanted to overachieve at everything. I took school really, really seriously. I wanted to do well and have a good career. And so the amount of pressure I put on myself also contributed to this emotional trauma building up. And combine that with a naturally smaller emotional barrel, I mean, it was the perfect storm for having having everything overspill in the form of physical sensations.
Thank you. That describes it so well. And this is what I see in the clients that I work with PoTS and hypermobility and long COVID and chronic fatigue. often the nervous system, probably from birth, is oversensitive, and there's something called a highly sensitive person.
Exactly.
And most people would score quite highly on the highly sensitive person. And that's a trait. So there might be a genetic element. We don't really know. It might be past history, your maternal mother when she's carrying you, the influence, what stresses she had, how that influenced you as the fetus when you're born, birth trauma. All of this could be influencing.
Mm-hmm.
So like you say, that stress bucket already, it's small.
Yeah.
Or you start off with this stress bucket with only a certain amount of stress hormones that are sort of there. It's already half full when you're born. So that sets up your whole nervous system to be sensitive and sensitized to your environment.
Mm-hmm.
And often there's a collection of a perfect storm, a collection of stresses that come together that tip the body into this dysregulated state.
Totally. And I mean, I had definitely direct experience with that, where my mum would often describe me having these form of health explosions, where after a series of very big exams, once they were finished, I would always say, oh, I'm so looking forward to having these out the way. But as soon as they were out the way, what typically ended up happening is I would have a big POTS flare up, or there would be some form of health condition that would come up that would leave me, in bed, unable to do anything for a decent period of time. And it was just sort of indicative of my brain being able to process when it was in acute fight or flight, when it was running away from the threat, if you will. It was able to function. But once I reached a sense of safety, my brain had to alert me to the fact that these are all the things that have actually been happening whilst you've been under enormous stress. So you need to rest and relax. Whereas I just never realized that happened. I thought, I don't really know what I thought. I think I just thought it was a huge coincidence that it happened every time.
And again, you mentioned some of the personality traits, perfectionist and driven, often analytical, people pleaser,
Mm-hmm.
want to do everything for other people. They're often similar kind of traits. I've got a little picture where I show people these traits, the people I work with, and they say, I tick all of them.
Yeah.
So again, it's this personality trait pattern that I see with this people group.
Yes, absolutely. And I agree with your clients. I also fit into all of them. And I think something that's really worth mentioning is we don't have to change who we are to recover. I think that a lot of the time people say, well, I was born this way and I can't change who I am, so maybe I'll never recover. You absolutely don't need to change that. All of these personality traits are often protectors that have developed over time to maximize your chances of feeling safe. And I know that for me personally, I am still the same analytical, hypervigilant, sensitive, people-pleasing type of person. That hasn't changed. It's just I'm able to view those characteristics and qualities for what they are. They're something that in the past have helped me an enormous amount. And I can see the way that they've developed to serve me rather than to hold me back.
Yeah, well put. Yeah. And so they all have, often certain traits just become more dominant in us.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a positive aspect to that as well, even though it can be self-destructive.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of finding out, getting a balance with it, looking at the positives, but trying to see these traits for what they are. And they've served you, they've served a purpose, they've protected you, and accepting that with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just emotional characteristics that serve this purpose, as you implied then, it's the physical sensations. If you're having constant fainting spells or dizziness spells, or if you're in pain, what do both of those experiences prevent you from doing? They prevent you from going out and living life in a very overwhelming environment. They're designed to get you to slow down and to keep you safe. So although we might build up very negative connotations with our symptoms, the reason they're there is to actually try and help, not to destroy your life.
They're knocking. There's a message behind these sensations. You just need to start to listen and tap into what is it trying to tell you just now.
Yes, absolutely.
So expand more on how you got yourself better.
So there were
sidetrack.
Yeah, there were a set of sort of key tools that I initially, well, I used. Step one was really just understanding what was going on with me. So as I mentioned previously, we've grown up in a society that assumes physical sensations means a physical problem. Now, that is an outdated assumption to make now. The neuroscience really demonstrates that we can experience physical symptoms in the absence of any structural damage. So the first thing I did was really research and understand what was going on, that my symptoms were the result of a brain that was perceiving danger. And so it was activating a danger alarm signal in order to get me to slow down and to keep me safe. That was step one, and really researching the studies that back up this theory of how emotional danger is perceived in the brain and how it's perceived in the same region of the brain as physical pain. All of that really helped to build up my confidence and my belief that this was what was going on with me. Now, after doing this, that sort of naturally led into step two. When I really believed in the science backing up all of this, I then moved on. It allowed me to reframe the way that I viewed my symptoms. So this was really step two, going from looking at my symptoms as chronic, something that I was going to have to deal with for the rest of my life, to looking at them as something that was temporary. It was just a danger alarm signal switching on and off. And in the same way as if you get a paper cut, you don't look at your paper cut and are terrified that the pain of the paper cut is going to continue for the rest of your life. You know that your brain will switch off the pain as the paper cut heals. It's about viewing these symptoms in the exact same way. They're only there because my brain is perceiving danger. So when I cultivate an environment that feels safe, when I cultivate a safe environment, my brain, it will allow these danger alarm signals to switch off. And just believing, building up my confidence in the fact that my brain was not actually doing anything wrong. It was behaving exactly as it should, given the input it was getting. Previously, all the information I was giving my brain is, I am in danger, these symptoms are terrifying, there is something wrong with me. That was not conducive to allowing my brain's danger alarm signal to switch off. So what did it do? Just continued firing, and it became better and better at learning how to fire, which is why my symptoms became worse. So step two, as I said, was reframing these symptoms, realizing that they were temporary, understanding that because the brain is neuroplastic, that's what allows us to recover. So our brain can rewire at any point in our life. Our brain is neuroplastic until the day that we die. So because these symptoms are a learned habit of the brain, as we change the way that we view the symptoms, as we cultivate a safer environment, the brain can learn that these symptoms don't have to be generated, and so it can switch the danger alarm signal off. So it's this neuroplasticity, this feature of the fact that everybody's brain, it's not 95% of brains that are neuroplastic, everybody's brain is neuroplastic. So if your symptoms are non-structural in nature, you absolutely have the potential to recover. So that was a really important fact that helped me in my recovery. And then I think step three, the final step after understanding the science, understanding that these symptoms were temporary, step three was, okay, well, it's now time to focus on self-soothing. Now, this can take many different forms for many different people, and also for the same person, depending on the context. So there are many different techniques that one can use, but a question that I like to ask myself regularly throughout the day is, what can I do now to make myself feel a bit safer? Now, that can be something as simple as saying, actually, I fancy having a cup of tea. That would really help soothe me. Or I fancy wrapping myself in a blanket. I would find that comforting. And then it can progress to, more advanced techniques, such as somatic tracking, which is learning how to look at your symptoms in the absence of fear and demonstrate to your brain that these experiences are safe. Now, there are many, many different techniques out there, but I think that the most useful starting question is, what can I do? What would I intuitively feel would make me feel more comfortable and safe in this moment now?
That's a really nice summary. You've just kind of categorized it really well. And there's so many tools out there. It's finding what is the right thing for you to do, and it is very individual.
Absolutely. You know, I remember in my recovery trying some techniques out at the beginning and thinking, oh gosh, I don't like that. That didn't make me feel particularly comfortable. And then much further down in my recovery journey saying, I wonder how I would react to that now. And it became an invaluable tool in my toolkit. So it's just about keeping an open mind and recognizing that something that may work for you now may be less suitable in the future, and something that seems a lot less suitable now may be useful down the line.
That's really useful to think about. It's always worth revisiting some of these tools. Do you have any other thoughts around some of the tools that you have used that you want to share?
I think the most important thing, or some of the most valuable tools that I experienced, are things that specifically focused on activating the parasympathetic nervous system. I found breath work to be very helpful, grounding work to be very helpful. Depending on the severity of the symptoms, sometimes splashing a little bit of cold water on my face to stimulate my vagus nerve could be helpful. But that was the sort of general category of techniques that I would focus towards, as anything that really helped generate a sense of calm.
That's really useful. So we started our conversation right at the beginning talking about the whole Ehlers-Danlos diagnosis. Would you be willing to just share some of your thoughts around that?
Absolutely. Well, Ehlers-Danlos has become a really big buzz phrase in recent years. I've seen many people walking away from a doctor's office with an Ehlers-Danlos diagnosis, and I view it currently as a bit of an excuse to explain chronic symptoms when no structural pathology has been found. I know in my situation, I'm abundantly aware of the fact that I do have a genetic condition disorder. Like I said, I have many physical attributes that show that to be the case. But I also, in my clinic and in my work, have had many clients who have display absolutely no physical attributes of a connective tissue disorder, and their diagnosis has been made purely as a result of some chronic symptom experience in combination with some marginal or moderate hypermobility. Now, whilst it can be, when you're suffering, you really just want answers. So I really genuinely understand why initially there can be a sense of a huge relief of, oh, okay, well, this is it. This is explaining my symptom experience. The problem with this, though, is although a diagnosis might provide a level of comfort to begin with, it becomes self-limiting, because when it comes to Ehlers-Danlos, hypermobility Ehlers-Danlos, there's no specific gene that's been found to explain the symptom experience, but you are told that it's genetic. So suddenly you have this concept in your mind of, this is something that I'm going to have the rest of my life. This is something that I'm going to have to deal with. But I think a more important question is it really the hypermobility or the Ehlers-Danlos that's causing these symptoms? And I would argue no. The reason for this is, even just in my personal experience, I had a very happy, I had a healthy childhood I didn't have POTS symptoms until I was 14, which is still relatively young, but I had a period of time before that with no symptoms at all. And yet this is something structurally that I've had for my whole life. I've been just as hypermobile my whole life. So why didn't I have any symptoms before? If this is something that's genetic, it didn't make sense to me. Similarly, I mean, in order to recover, I did absolutely no ounce of strength training or physiotherapy in order to alleviate my symptoms. Not one little bit. So I am just as hypermobile now as I ever was when I was experiencing my worst symptoms. And yet my physical experience is totally different. And that's just, I haven't just experienced this with myself. I see this with clients all the time, that they recover, not through strength training or changing their actual structural integrity, or by changing the level of their hypermobility, but by using techniques that enable the brain to perceive a safer environment, thus allowing the danger alarm signal to switch off. So, I mean, another argument for hypermobility not causing pain or not causing these uncomfortable sensations is the fact that pretty much everybody on earth is hypermobile in at least one joint. And yet they don't experience, that doesn't mean that you experience debilitating symptoms. So I just find it to be really unconvincing that hypermobility, when I can still have it and have no pain whatsoever, and I've seen this time and time again, is the root cause of our symptoms. I find that to be a very unsatisfactory explanation.
And I fully agree with that. And I teach Pilates, it's one of my many hats, and observing hundreds of people move, and so many people have an element of hypermobility, and actually would meet the criteria for generalized hypermobility if you did a scoring system, but they have no symptoms. And I've had people who are so hypermobile with no symptoms at all, and somebody who I look at, watch them move and think, you know, you're really not that hypermobile, no more hypermobile than the person next door, but they have a whole stack of symptoms and sensations, which has been hooked onto this diagnostic label of it's a sort of hypermobility spectrum disorder, and then it moves on to what is the hypermobile EDS, where they believe there is a gene for the hypermobile EDS, even though they haven't actually found a gene.
Yeah, and it might be the case that there's a genetic predisposition to having this smaller emotional barrel. That may be the case. So there may be a genetic component to this, as we said earlier, but I don't believe that the symptoms are caused by the hypermobility. I do believe that the symptoms are the result of nervous system dysregulation and an overactive danger alarm signal of the brain. And that's why these approaches have been demonstrated to be so effective for people with chronic pain, particularly in the hypermobile sphere.
And often in the PoTS world, people will link PoTS and hypermobility. So I know that some people would say, well, you can't have a PoTS diagnosis unless you're hypermobile. So the two have been linked together. But actually, it's separating them out, that PoTS is not caused by hypermobility. It's all this. Hypermobility is a normal variant. Lots of people are hypermobile. But PoTS is a nervous system, immune system dysregulation.
Absolutely. And I've certainly worked with people who have PoTS who have no indication of hypermobility at all. So I wouldn't agree with the statement that they are always 100% linked. But you know, there genuinely may be a correlation between hypermobility and PoTS, but is it the fact that it's not the hypermobility, it's the fact that there might be a combination of genes that makes you more likely to be hypermobile, but also makes it more likely to have a hypersensitive personality type? You know, that could be the explanation. Correlation is not causation. And that is what is so important to remember. Just because there is a correlation between people with hypermobility and people with PoTS does not mean that it is the hypermobility that is causing the PoTS. And that's crucial.
Absolutely. And then you've got this whole area of epigenetics. So yes, there might be a genetic predisposition, but then it's what has turned that gene on in the first place. And so that's another whole interesting area when you start thinking about genetics.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
mental factors that line up in a certain order to switch a particular gene on.
Absolutely. I mean, that's certainly a whole separate field. Just because we have a particular allele doesn't mean that is how that is going to be expressed. You know, our genes are able to be turned on, they're able to be switched off. And it's true that in response to different environmental stresses, our gene activation may differ. So, I mean, that's a whole separate, super interesting discussion. But the root fact remains that it doesn't really, we don't need to identify a specific gene. By just changing our conscious experience or awareness of our symptom experience, we can help allow the brain to reevaluate its perceived danger and switch the experience off.
Mm-hmm. So if you had a message or key tips you would like to communicate to people, what would it be?
I really think that I would just like people to give this a chance. So often I reached this work so late because I was genuinely so unwilling to accept that this could possibly be what was going on with me. So, and the reason for that, as I said earlier, is because I just didn't believe that my symptoms could ever be created by the brain because they felt so real. But what I failed to understand is the symptoms are real, they are happening, and yet they can still be controlled by the brain. In the same way as if you break your ankle, it is not your ankle that's causing the pain, it is your brain deciding to switch on pain for your ankle. It's the brain that controls the generation of pain, whether it's structural or non-structural. So I just wish that people would give this a go. Just do the research. The research speaks for itself. The scientific literature that's coming out, that's being published today, is incredibly compelling. This is not something that is a lesser approach, or it doesn't have to be a last ditch approach. It is something that ideally people will find a lot sooner, and so we'll be able to get better a lot sooner. The second thing I would like to say is everybody doubts in their ability to heal. It is normal to doubt that you will be the one to get better. And the thing that I always used to remind myself is the only thing that's required to get better is for our brain to be neuroplastic. And we absolutely know our brains are neuroplastic because that's why we have the symptoms to begin with. Because our brain rewired to become better and better and better at generating these symptoms. So recovery is possible. It doesn't matter how long you've had the symptoms. I had mine for over a decade. It doesn't matter how severe they are. They're just a fire alarm. That's all it is. It doesn't matter what volume the fire alarm is set to. When the fire is extinguished, the fire alarm will switch off. So recovery really, really is possible.
That's amazing. That just offers so much hope to people. And I fully agree. I fully agree. When you say recovery, do you feel you've fully 100% recovered, never have any sensations ever again?
And that's a very interesting, very, very interesting point. I would say I've 100% recovered in the form that when you break your ankle and the pain goes away, and say you break your ankle 2 years down the line, you don't say that your pain was as a result of the first break. You treat each event independently. I know that in life, if I don't look after myself, if I don't focus on self-soothing, my danger alarm signal will switch on, because it does with structural pain as well. But I don't believe in this concept of remission, because when it's there, it's because my brain feels in danger. When I self-soothe, when I reframe my experience, the danger alarm signal switches off. Now, down the line, it may so happen that I'm in an overwhelming situation where my brain begins to feel a little bit nervous or a little bit overwhelmed again. And it may alert that to me in the form of a physical sensation. But that's fine. The most important thing is that it's temporary, because I know how to deal with it. So I consider myself 100% recovered to the point where I can experience non-structural symptoms in the same way that absolutely anybody on earth can experience non-structural symptoms.
That's, again, explained really well. I think that's the reality. We all experience sensations. The warning sign will be turned on, but we just need to be willing to listen to those signs, listen to our body, and know what we need at that time when you're willing to listen.
Exactly, I totally agree.
Anyway, I think we'll finish there. I will put a link to Gigi's website on YouTube. So if you want to connect with Gigi more, then that will be available to you. And any other resources that I feel are relevant, I'll add that on as well.